You were involved with the Beatles for years, right?
From before the beginning until the end.
In what capacity?
Well, at the beginning, I worked in a record store. I ran a record store in Liverpool with Brian Epstein, who was the first manager. And the Beatles used to come into the store to listen to new stateside records. In those days, they couldn't afford to buy them, so they'd come in and listen to them in the store. And then later, Brian saw them and heard them in the Cavern, which is a local club, signed them to a management contract, managed to get them a record contract, and then we all moved to London, and then we started Beatlemania, and arrived at the Ed Sullivan Show, Shea Stadium, the world.
Peter was, actually Peter's being modest, he was closer to them than almost anybody else in the world. I mean, he was managing director of NIMS, their management corporation, and he was chief operating officer of Apple, that famed financial, Beatles financial kingdom where they gave away all that money and stuff. But he was also a dear friend to the Beatles and an advisor. He was best man at John and Yoko's wedding, and he introduced Paul McCartney to Linda McCartney, a day that many of the Beatles fans still rue. And he kept the Beatles' passports locked in his desk drawer so they couldn't skip town without him knowing. So he really was on the inside.
Steve, what is your involvement in the book?
I'm a former newspaper columnist and author. I've written a lot of books on pop personalities. I wrote Marjo and Alice Cooper's biography, and I was the top of the pop columnist for the Sunday News in New York City when Peter was producing movies like Tommy and Jesus Christ Superstar, and he was producing a show called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on Broadway, and I wrote a piece about it. He introduced me to John Lennon. I got my first interview with John Lennon through Peter, and at the time I told Peter he should write a book about the Beatles, but he explained that the inner group, John, Paul, George, Ringo, Peter, Neil Aspinall, their road manager, never talked about the subject. There was a code of secrecy, like the Mafia code of secrecy, and that none of them had ever broken it. So I kept after Peter for about 5 years to go ahead and write this book and to speak to the Beatles.
To break the code.
Well, with their agreement.
It wasn't so much.
You did get there.
Oh, yeah. What happened was, by 1979, and there'd been so many projects that had come out, books, television, movies, about the Beatles, and they were all so inaccurate, so very inaccurate, and because the writers had never been able to go to source and check their facts. So I thought the situation was becoming serious, and something definitive should be written. And I talked this over with John and Paul and George and Ringo, and I decided that I would write a book with Stephen's collaboration and with their cooperation. So once they decided to help me and to cooperate, then everyone else was released from their silence too, wives and ex-wives, and so we got it together, and we moved to England, and we did our research.
We got Peter's diaries. Peter had amazing diaries that listed the names of anybody that ever came into contact with the Beatles, and we went through those diaries and culled all the important names and literally conducted hundreds of interviews. We wanted it to be the definitive book with, of course, their enormous amount of help. Each of the Beatles contributed, many days, and in Paul McCartney's case, weeks of interviews and information. So it was exciting.
Hello and welcome to Something About the Beatles, episode number 280. Can't believe how close we are getting to 300, but we've been on a really good run of some great guests, and today is no exception. On the show today, I have Stephen Gaines, who, in this realm, you best know as the co-author of The Love You Make from 1983, and currently the new book of interviews that book was based on, entitled All You Need Is Love, just out now. And the former book, The Love You Make, is not without controversy. Even as it was published, you had certain people that were interviewed for the book, most notably the McCartneys, called it a betrayal, basically asserting that they had been interviewed under false pretenses and that the book was just salacious gossip. They famously burned it in a fireplace, but there were definitely people that felt that Peter Brown, an insider going back to the early stages of the Beatles with Brian Epstein, had been somebody that had betrayed their trust. He being somebody so inside, the only man who attended both Paul and John's March 1969 weddings, called out by John in name, a rare human not named Yoko, called out by name in a song penned by John Lennon. So that's as pretty insider as you can get. And this book was in the works in the months leading up to the murder of John Lennon. It is a good thing that as many interviews were done as there were prior to December 8th, 1980, because naturally that colored things that came afterward. And John was supposed to be interviewed. That didn't happen by Peter and Stephen, but Yoko was, and that was in the months, sometime in 1981 after the death of John. That naturally gives it a different slant than it might have had going into it. In any event, the book came out, and it fell somewhere between Philip Norman's Shout and The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldman. A lot of books written in the 80s, before the source material was available that is now, well as they could have been researched in the pre-internet era when you either had to talk to people, sometimes years after the events, or dig up research in libraries or other repositories of documents and such, it was a harder slog to create something than it is now. We've got so much information at your fingertips. And that is something we discussed, Stephen and I. But Stephen actually did the bulk of the writing of the book, as you will see here. And I did want to draw attention to the review done on Aaron Weber's blog, which critiques it from a historian's point of view, naturally, which Stephen saw and responded to. And it was a perfect response, which we talk about in the show. You'll get to hear that. But anyway, Stephen has written a number of books. He's well past Beatle world, yet I would imagine that The Love You Make may be the first sentence in his obituary one day, hopefully a long time from now, as it probably will be for Peter Brown as well. And some people know him for being the author of Heroes and Villains on the Beach Boys, which came out some point after The Love You Make, but he's been around for a long time. Not everything he writes concerns rock. I love the title of one of his books, One of These Things First, which those of you who get the reference should get a kick out of that. So here's my conversation with Stephen Gaines, and I found him a terrific interviewee. I would tell you that now getting the source interviews for The Love You Make is no small thing. He was the prime mover in making it happen. And I think that every Beatle fan interested, if you want to get the stories from people unfiltered as reported to these guys when they wrote that book, now's your chance to do it. And we talk about the veracity of individual interviewees throughout this conversation, but see what you think. I was doing a little background because I recognized, well, obviously the man's been working all these years. You had a book named after my favorite Nick Drake song, One of These Things First. And I thought, that's cool.
My very favorite Nick Drake song, yes. I love that song.
So maybe a fair way to start, because I don't know the answer to this question, is how did your fandom or awareness of the Beatles start? I've had a lot of first-generation fans on the show talking about the Ed Sullivan moment, but what is your connection? How did it start for you?
I was in high school. It was a snow day. A group of us had gone over to somebody's house, somebody's apartment, maybe 5 or 6 people. And one of them, I think one of the girls said, "Oh, you have to hear this song. They're the biggest thing. It's called I Want to Hold Your Hand." And then they played it. And I thought, nah, I mean, if you base it upon the one song, it was meh, so I didn't think very much of it at first. And then I started listening to them. And then very slowly, as the songs started to get more complicated and less of that 4/4, whatever it is, which is why they were called the Beatles, because of the beat. The songs got a little bit more complicated. I really, really began to like them and began to learn who they were and what instruments they played and who was composing the songs. It was slow. And I would say around Rubber Soul that they won me over so completely. I was just crazy about them. But it wasn't in the fan part of it. Mm-hmm. I loved them for the music. I wasn't yet in the fan part of it. So that's the way it started, high school.
So you would have been a Beach Boy?
No, I love Good Vibrations and some of their car songs and stuff. I really think it wasn't probably till Good Vibrations that I started listening to them. And then I had a friend who was in the music business who worked for Record World. And he said, "Oh, the Beach Boys this, the Beach Boys that." He shook me by the shoulders and he said, "What are you talking about? Listen to Holland. Listen to this song or that song." And then I realized I went back and I listened to the earlier Brian Wilson stuff. And then also I was informed by the fact that Brian had very deep psychiatric problems
Absolutely.
and that a lot of the music was being filtered through that. And what an amazing story it was, a fascinating story. And then it's funny because I had been commissioned to write a book about Calvin Klein, the fashion designer, and I hated it. I hated what I was doing. I would call up people in the fashion industry and say, "Hello, I'm writing a book about Calvin Klein. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions," and they'd slam the phone down on me.
Wow.
So I called up the publisher and I said, "I just can't bear it." And they said, "Well, Dennis Wilson drowned yesterday or 2 days before. Would you be interested?" Would I? Oh my God, what a great assignment for me.
Wow.
So that's how that started. I mean, I liked them kind of, but when I was invited into their realm and into the people and the wives and the ex-wives, you always get a great story from the wives and the ex-wives. You really can kind of get the inside story that way.
Sure.
So,
And by the time you would have started work on that, The Love You Make had already come out because you'd started that at least as far back as 1980, prior to John's death.
yes, that's absolutely right. It had already come out, and they asked me to do the Calvin book, and then Dennis drowned, and I said, well, let's just do it alphabetically. You
There you
know,
go.
BEA, you know. So, yes, that book had come out, The Love You Make had come out, and I decided that I wanted to do is detailed book about the Beach Boys, and then I was off on another horse race.
hmm
So that's how it happened.
How did the connection happen between you and Peter Brown to write The Love You Make?
Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on the Road was being produced by the Robert Stigwood organization. Robert Stigwood was an Australian entertainment entrepreneur, and he managed the Bee Gees, among others. And Peter Brown had become president when he left. When Peter Brown resigned from Beatle and Co., I think it was called at that time,
Uh-huh.
he went to the Robert Stigwood organization and he was producing this awful, awful show. They had the rights to do the music, but the show was absolutely nothing. It was a bad choice, I think. And there was a rehearsal, and 10 members, only 10 members of the press were invited to meet John Lennon. John was doing Peter a favor by going down to the theater on 2nd Avenue. And I waited in line. We were told each journalist had 4 minutes or 5 minutes with John. And I got so nervous waiting in line to speak to John that I just said the dumbest thing in the world to him. I said, "John, does it make you feel old to see Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band become an off-Broadway show?" And he said, "I don't need that to make me feel old, mate." And then he pushed me out of the way. I felt so bad. I blew my one shot with John Lennon, and Peter Brown was there. And he said, "I'll tell you, come with me, sit in the lounge." And we sat in the lounge. You must forgive me because I do Peter's voice now without even thinking about it. I recorded the whole thing. He told me in 1 hour the story of his life, how he met Brian, the Beatles, coming to London and all the rest of it. And when it was over, I said to him, "You've got to write a book." And he said, "Oh, no, no, I'll never write a book. I'll never write a book." And as if you ever decide to write a book, please call me. And then after that, Peter Brown and I became friends. He gave me my 30th birthday party. He came to dinner at my parents' house and stuff. And we got to be good friends. And then I think in early 1980, he called me, and he was living in Laguna Beach at the time. And I was in the city, in New York City. And he called me and asked me if I still wanted to write that book. And so I jumped on an airplane, and I spent about 4 months in Laguna Beach writing the proposal. Let me tell you, it was tough to spend 4 months in Laguna Beach with Peter Brown. So anyway, that's when it started, 1980. And it's funny because everything gets so compressed. And, you know, who expected it? If you told me January and February of 1980 that my world was going to spin like it did, I wrote the proposal, we sent it in, we sold it immediately. We sold it in England and several other countries just on the basis of a proposal. In September, we moved to London. And then September, October, November, we were in London doing most of the interviews during those 3 months. And then we came back, I think around November 10th, November 15th. So we came back 2 or 3 weeks before John was murdered. And all the interviews were done before John was murdered. So we got a different opinion, they never would have said the things, not that they said bad things, but they never would have been quite so frank and honest about their relationship with John. One of the things that I learned was that they all totally respected John. Ringo, George, Paul, it really disturbed them that John had gone away, that John wasn't part of the group anymore. In the interviews in this new book, you'll see them all worried, Paul ruminating about what he had to do to be John's friend, and he kept on calling him up, but he wouldn't, and George saying, I wonder if John read I Me Mine, the book that he wrote. I wonder if he's angry because I didn't mention his name. They were all concerned about what John thought. And then, of course, although I found it very hard to accept, John was the leader of the group. It was John's group. I kept on thinking, no, it's John and Paul's group, and they're all kind of equal. But no, they all thought that John was the leader of the group, and he was. So as it evolved, I found out all sorts of things, doing these interviews, living in London, that I never expected, and it fascinated me.
When I had Patty on the show recently, it was interesting you say this because apparently she got an advance copy of this new book, and she said that she was learning things that she didn't know were going on at the time. So that aligns completely. And it is the new book is a bit of a rashomon where you have two different witnesses describing exactly the same thing in completely different ways. But I think it was Neil Aspinall that said in there, there's a quote in there about, well, why would you ask me about that? I'm going to give you my version of things, and it could be completely at odds, but this was my experience, that was that person's experience. That's how life works. That's just how it is.
That is how life works. And it fascinates me that the impressions of what happened and how it happened could be so different, so very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of it. Originally, when we were writing the new book, which is all interviews from the book from 40 years ago, I was disturbed that things didn't connect, that somebody said one thing and somebody said the other. And then it took me a long time to realize, that's the whole point about this. Peter said this wonderful thing the other day about the contradictions in what happened and what actually happened. And he said, well, I think it depends on where you were sitting. And I think that's a great piece of philosophy. How you approach something, what you were thinking, where you were sitting psychologically was the way you remembered things and what you expected out of it.
And that sort of begs the question, when you wrote the book back in the 80s, The Love You Make, how did you make the judgments of whose truth was the one to go with as you're composing this narrative?
Well, it wasn't as difficult then because I was choosing quotes and building a narrative. Whatever most into the story, I suppose, it was pretty clear that certain people would lie, like Alan Klein. And it's transparent. When I interviewed Magic Alex, it was so transparent. He was lying about the Beatles wanted him so desperately to come to Rishikesh to be with the Maharishi. And this one wrote him a letter. And then when somebody called, he said, and then I didn't realize it at the time, but I don't think that they had great phone service back then from Rishikesh to London, that he was getting phone calls from the Beatles. There were no cell phones. I don't think they were going over a payphone and saying, hey, we need you here with the Maharishi. Of course, when he went down there, he lied about the Maharishi and what he knew and ruined it for the Beatles. Ruined this lovely thing, I think, that they were trying to do. Mm-hmm. So I knew some people lied and some people didn't. When I transcribed all of the tapes, when we had all the tapes transcribed, mm-hmm. I realized that there were some serious contradictions and that I was just going to put in the contradictions and let the reader figure out who they believed and who they thought was telling the truth.
You're talking about for the new book versus the original
book. The new book.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
There is a little bit of footnoting here and there. Well, this person is leaving this out or this person is completely lying. I will tell you, you cited the two chapters that I found the most problematic, Magic Alex and Alan Klein. Klein particularly because in the pages of that transcription, I totally got how he was able to steamroll people. When he's throwing jargon at you and numbers at you and dollar amounts, It was the one that I found the most difficult to wrap my head around. It's like, I need a translation of this because I don't know what the hell he's saying. But I could see in his physical presence how he can arm twist anybody into anything.
He was a real snake oil salesman. He had every number and figure and thing was in his head. Didn't have to really write anything down. He remembered numbers, and he was an apt liar. He was a very, very smooth, very good liar, and as proved through court cases, through the IRS in the United States, he lied his way through everything. There's one point in Alan Klein's interview in the new book where we say something about he stole money from the Beatles, and he said, well, the Beatles, I couldn't have stolen money because the Beatles was paid to whatever corporation it was. And then he said, but that corporation gave me the money to give to the Beatles. So, I mean, it was a little hedge. I was never paid. A shell corporation was paid. And then you took your cut, or maybe more than your cut. So remember the big concert that George gave, charity concert for Bangladesh, I think it was. Mm-hmm. That money also, the money that they raised went through Alan Klein's pockets as well.
Absolutely. For starving people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Alan Klein certainly wasn't starving. And I never met so many people who really, really hated the guy. Like Paul really hated the guy. So many other people just couldn't stand Alan. And by the time I got to interview him, by the way, he didn't give interviews like that. I went there with Peter Brown to interview him. I started asking him questions. After 5 minutes, I think Alan Klein realized, oh, this is serious. These guys know what they're talking about. So he said, I can't talk now. We'll have to make another appointment when there's more time. So we packed up and we left, and we pressed him for another appointment, and he gave us another interview. It just went on for an hour and a half, and there was nothing we couldn't ask him about or couldn't talk about, so it was worthwhile. But he realized, I think, the first interview that this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around, right. That they had called in the Marines here, and we were going to really ask him questions.
Yeah, you guys were prepped for sure. And contextually, the listeners should know that this sit-down with Klein, both of them, happened after he'd been convicted. That court case in the late 1979, I believe, that he ended up doing prison time for.
Yeah, he would lie about anything, though. It's really remarkable.
With conviction.
I know other people who are fabulous and live in kind of crazy worlds and just will make up just absolutely anything on the spot and believe it themselves, I think.
And what you're just describing there was the way I felt reading Yoko's chapter. She conveniently leaves out in 1980, the year that you're interviewing her, that she was back on heroin that year, which she has since admitted to other people. And her telling of things definitely is not backed up by other tellings of the same thing from other people. So not that I want to get into this anti-Yoko thing, but on the other hand, I found it very striking in the book that more than one witness declared John to be a masochist as a way of sort of explaining how he ended up in this particular relationship.
That John was a masochist? In what way do you mean?
It's in your book. People describing that he was punishing himself by being with Yoko. I'm trying to remember, well, Alex, a broken clock is right at least twice a day. And you want to take everything he says as BS, but he was the one that did make the point. John could have had anybody, any beautiful woman, anybody in the world, but he chose Yoko. And he sort of saying it as a tacit punishment for himself. And somebody else that said the same thing. I don't know if it's John Dunbar or someone else in the book.
Well, I don't think he did it to necessarily hurt himself. It's very odd because somebody says in the book that John could have had the most beautiful woman in the world. He could have had anybody, and then he chose Yoko, who the person who says it, I forget who it is, John Dunbar, one of those people, said she wasn't very attractive. She was kind of masculine in a certain way, but she was, John felt, his intellectual equal.
A chum.
A chum. Yeah, a buddy. A replacement for Paul, actually.
100%. And to be fair, people did say that of Paul, too. He could have had anybody. Why did he go for this woman? But it is described, there's distinctions made between the Yoko and the Linda approach in the book by people that you talk to.
Yeah, I don't really, I don't think John was trying to hurt himself. I think John was just miserable, and he was in tremendous pain, more than we believe. I know everybody says the song Help, he wrote that, but I think it was a lot worse than that. It was being in a pressure cooker. Nowadays, Stars are used to it. There's the internet. There's everything. We've lived through the Beatles and all these famous people. But at the time, they were the first that really were this big, that really were doing international tours of music. The speaker systems weren't even strong enough. They didn't have amplifiers. They flew commercial. They didn't have private jets. They were flying with other passengers on commercial planes. So
Right.
the world was really a pressure cooker. It was very different than we know it today. And it was hard for them. All to their credit, none of them really behaved very badly to the public or destroyed hotel rooms or
Right.
did all the things that other people do to release pressure.
Right. They weren't Led Zeppelin.
No, they weren't Led Zeppelin.
So one of the things I did want to ask you, going back to doing the research for the original book, was you did a ton of interviews in London, then you moved to New York. You're just tracking down all these canny witnesses. Were there people you wanted to get that wouldn't agree to sit down for an interview?
No, not that I can think of.
Okay.
You know, it was Peter Brown. I didn't ask for the interviews. Peter Brown asked for the interviews.
Uh-huh.
Nobody really turned down Peter's. So just trying to think if there's somebody that I would have liked to have interviewed that I didn't. But I can't think of anybody. There are a lot of interviews that aren't in the book, in the new book, All You Need Is Love, because they were so boring.
Okay, is it fair to say that the finished book then is sort of cream of the interviews that you did get? Because one of the things I was wondering in reading it is that some of them start or end abruptly, like there was more being said, and I didn't know if that was for the sake of book space or you just scooped in the best stuff. Is there a lot more out there? Because originally it was in Billboard, you give an interview in 2019 where you described 60 to 80 hours of interviews. And I don't know what this book would come out to on tape, but it would seem to me there's substantially more interview material than ended up in the new book. So is that something you could speak to in terms of what do you think the balance is? How much more is there out there?
I think there were more than 60 to 80 hours. I'm not sure. It's funny because I used 90-minute tapes back then for some reason in the cassette.
Uh-huh.
I think there are 80-something cassette tapes, but sometimes some of them are blank on one side, sometimes there was a lot. There must have easily been 200,000 words, perhaps even more. And then I had to figure out, for instance, the publishers were great. They asked very little of me in terms of don't do that or do this. But Clive Epstein, Brian Epstein's younger brother, who was left with all the problem, the Gordian knot of trying to get the Beatles out and get his money out and his mother's money out from the Beatles when Brian died and everything, was so detailed and laborious to read and to listen to that the publisher said to me, do we really need Clive? And I said, well, what is a brother to do? He said, but so boring. And it's true. I just took Clive out. We didn't learn anything about it. We learned a little bit about English law and inheritance and stuff. So there's stuff like that. I wish I had a list with me and I can tell you, but there was a secretary that we didn't use. She talked how hard it was to get into Apple past in Savile Row. Mm-hmm. So there were things like that we really didn't use. You asked a question about sometimes they end abruptly. The thing is that people think that now you have a professional setup to do Zoom and electronics and everything is so much more sophisticated. But at the time, there was just this little cassette recorder and these cheap 90-minute cassettes. And I would put it down on the table, always saying, the recorder, is that okay? And then I would take notes. So it would never seem to be a formal interview because Peter was there. You know, Can I get you another sherry? Do you know who we saw yesterday? Oh, how is she? She gained some weight. There was all this stuff that went on. And even in the middle of the interviews, the doorbell would ring and Peter would say, I thought you were going to get the dry cleaning. You went to the wrong dry cleaners. This was all in the middle of the interview.
Sure.
So when you hear the interview shut off, first of all, I kind of like the idea that it just ended there. Uh-huh. And I promise you, they were never cut off because something important was said. They ended like that because then suddenly we went out of interview mode and we got into, how are you going to get home? Do you have a taxi or, and it turned back into that. And in fact, the interview with Patty Boyd, Harrison Clapton, I forget her married name now, but the interview with Patty was like about fashion and about Mary Quant and about the things that interested them. I actually wanted to know a lot of things about swinging London from her point of view. But that turned out not to belong in this book.
I see. Uh-huh.
So yes, things were edited out. Patty is very short because those were the only things that I could find that I thought were pertinent in her interview.
Okay. And will these sources be made available for any Beatles scholars? Like, is there going to be a university or something you guys could put this stuff to access?
So glad you asked that. I'm so glad you asked that. I want so badly to give these tapes and all my notebooks and everything else to a university. I have to convince Peter of that because I've suggested that all along. From the very beginning, it's against the law to play somebody's voice without their permission. I didn't realize that, but there's a law prohibiting us from just playing the tapes.
Like an audiobook?
You need permission from living people to do an audiobook.
I see.
It turns out the law is, I didn't know any of that. So we really felt like our hands were tied behind our back. And until I came up with the idea of let's just transcribe every single tape and use that. So while we were stuck there, not being able to figure out what to do, UCLA called me and asked me if I would donate to them my Beach Boy tapes and all my Beach Boy notes. And I said, well, I would, but I happen to have these Beatle tapes, which are, I think, very valuable. Will you take the Beatle tapes too? They said, no, we're only interested in the Beach Boys. So I thought, oh, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard.
That's insane.
UCLA turning down those tapes. So then, without Peter's specific permission, I started calling places. I called the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I called the New York Public Library Arts Collection. They have an amazing collection of things at the New York Public Library, very, very well kept. I called the Clive Davis School of Music at New York University, and I wrote to Liverpool University, thinking that we could give them to Liverpool University. And Peter was just not ready to say yes to give them away. And when we went to an agent, he said, what are you guys, idiots? These tapes are worth a huge deal of money. But I didn't care at that point. I'm going to be 78 or something. And Peter, too. Peter's going to be 87 tomorrow, I think. And this is a part of a legacy. And I really believe that these tapes were historic, not just about some rock and roll group. I can't say that the Beach Boy tapes were historic. But the Beatles are in another class, a whole other arena of importance in terms of culture, in terms of what we learned, how we changed, how we dressed, how we thought about feminism, women's rights. The anti-war movement in America was very different than what it was in Great Britain. Over here, it was kind of like a hippie movement about the Vietnam War, or at least it was considered that. Things were much different in London, and I wanted all of those tapes. Mm-hmm. I wanted all of those people to be free to the public. So I'm still pushing in that direction. I still want these tapes, everything, to be available at a university in MP3 files, somewhere up in a cloud, where you can just click on and say, here's Yoko, or here's this. So I'm hoping one day that every last word will be available.
That would be fantastic. As you say, you needn't be a scholar writing about the Beatles to find value in this stuff.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true.
I don't know if you know this or not. I know it's sort of a loaded triggering point for a lot of people to mention Albert Goldman's book. But the fact is, even Mark Lewison and a lot of Beatles scholars and researchers recognize that his research, never mind the end product, but the people he had working and doing the interviews, is all top-notch stuff. And that's at Columbia University. So Beatles scholars can dig through that stuff and come up with things. But it would be nice to see something that you guys amassed just as available.
I didn't know Columbia University took Albert Goldman's stuff. Albert Goldman wrote some really, really good books. I think the Elvis book was his, and yeah. I forget what else. But he wrote some really well-researched books. But something happened by the time he got to the Beatles. And there were a lot of lies, a lot of things that he made up. He just really wanted to exploit it and to make a lot of money on it. And in fact, he disappeared when the book was published. You couldn't find him. Everybody said he went to England because I guess he didn't want to take the flak. But I'm surprised that a university like Columbia University would take Albert Goldman's research materials. His research materials are probably more honest than the book was. But the book was filled with lies. It was insulting. And I got thrown in, any book got just thrown in, another lying book about the Beatles. He made it hard for everybody else. And he passed away, unfortunately, on an airplane, I think. I think he had a heart attack from cocaine.
Hmm.
So I'm not exactly sure. So
Yeah.
that's that.
Well, you're opening an interesting door here. Everything I'm about to say is with all due respect. Starting with when The Love You Make came out, here you've got this insider. First of all, it's sort of this half memoir, half biography. And at the time, there were people that you spoke to, most notably the McCartneys, that used the word betrayal, that we thought we were sitting for one thing, a book on the 60s, and ended up being something else. Famously, the story of Paul receives a copy and Linda photographs it burning in the fireplace and all that stuff. So I know that there's been, as with Shout, Philip Norman, as the years go on and the bar has been set higher and higher in Beatles scholarship, some of the esteem that these books may once have had, and it was a bestseller, has diminished through the years. Now, Peter Brown, you read quotes from him around the time of Anthology, I think, and this is a quote making the rounds, when he saw that The Love You Make was not lumped in as among the finest Beatle biographies, he was, quote, pissed off about it, which is why it was republished in 2002. Now, in my research for this interview, I found a wonderful quote from you, a wonderful reaction that I'm going to read for the sake of the listeners. And this was in response to Erin Weber, who's a friend of mine. She's a historian, and she runs a blog that apparently you saw her review of The Love You Make, and this was your response. It's a fair review. Well done. Here's some of what really happened. The book was never meant to be a memoir, no first person. When half of it was written, the ignorant publisher decided it should be rewritten in first person. I refused, a battle ensued, and then it was decided that I would rewrite portions of the book in first person, and the rest would resume the third person biography style. Also, I had complete control over the contents of the book, except for the way Peter Brown was depicted. At the time, I believed everything Peter told me. I'm sorry for the errors. I hope it's still a good read. A certain amount of contrition from you, but continued defensiveness from Peter Brown. I thought that was a wonderful response to the review. So I guess my question is, looking back on it, on The Love You Make, how do you regard it? I think it's fair for every artist, every author to not esteem their work. It's like, I could have done that better, couldn't this better. How do you feel about it?
I think it's pretty good, The Love You Make. I think, remember, there was no internet at the time. Every scrap of information you had to get personally, either going to a library or speaking to somebody. So that was very difficult. Also, it depends where you're sitting, as Peter Brown said. He was sitting in a certain place and he remembered things a certain way. I must tell you that I was, the battle that I said is, I wrote a book where I had to take, and Peter Brown had absolutely nothing to do with the writing. He wasn't supposed to have anything to do with the writing. He did his job. He lived it. I was going to write it down.
And he opened doors that you could then sit these people down. He gave you access.
Absolutely. Gave me access. And the thing that happened, though, was I had so many stories that I had to pull together, that I had to knit together in one thing. I had never done anything that massive before with that many different characters.
Mm-hmm.
And to tell the inside of a story that I wasn't that familiar with. I mean, I knew as much as the public did, you know. So, Peter Brown did not have control over what I wrote, because I was afraid, that was in the original contract, I was afraid that I was going to say, I want to start this when Cynthia comes home and finds Yoko Ono in her bathrobe. And Peter would say, no, I think I want to start it when we were recording. I couldn't write a book that way. I had to write the book my way with his information. And so I did that. I was 3/4 of the way through, gave that part to the publisher. They were in seventh heaven. They were really, really thrilled. And then they called a big meeting where the agents went to it and everybody. And Gladys Carr, who was head of McGraw-Hill at the time, said, we have to have this in first person because you have to be there. And the only way we can be there is through Peter. So I said no. And then she exploded. Her scalp was on the ceiling. She exploded so much. And there was yelling and screaming. I threatened to quit and to walk out. And finally, I just said, okay, this isn't what I signed on to do, but I will change parts of it to first person. And of course, that was a complaint of some of the critics. Why does it go to first person from third person? That happened and it confused people, but that's what they wanted. It also, McGraw-Hill, the same woman, Gladys Carr, she said, anytime something new comes up, you have to write, revealed here for the first time. And I said, I've written many, many books. I've never used those words. It's not necessary. But they insisted, they absolutely insisted that I write revealed here for the first time. So it cheapened the book, I think, all of that.
It's internal hyping of the book you're already reading.
Yeah, no, I know. But, I couldn't say anything to them. I couldn't change it. I just had to. I was the underdog at the time, and I just had to do. I'll tell you another interesting thing is that I called it The Love You Make. And then there was another meeting when they said, we've discussed the title and the title doesn't work. So what do you mean the title doesn't work? I said, just think of it. It's a verb. It's about making love. It's another message also about being loving to people and everything. It's a famous lyric, from What Do You Mean? No, come back next week with 3 new titles that are sexier than that. So next week I came back with, I wish I remembered all 3, but the first one was Between the Sheets with the Beatles.
Was this facetious?
Yes, I gave them the worst titles. I came in with the most horrible titles that you ever heard. So the issue kind of dropped. In this new book, they named All You Need Is Love. They named it Come Together. So I said, no, I can't. This can't be Come Together. And so there was this phone conference where they finally said, just let it be, let it be. Just let it be, and we'll figure something out. So what I did cleverly was I never brought it up again. But wherever I put the title, I wrote All You Need Is Love. I didn't tell them that I had erased Come Together, and they never noticed. Suddenly, the book just became called All You Need Is Love. So publishers sometimes can really mess, and if they don't know what the point is. And it was hard to convince people that these were really historic, that the Beatles were not going to go the way of Elvis or Marilyn Monroe. This was foundational stuff about how our nations grew, how our awareness of issues grew, what the Beatles brought to it, what a tremendous force they were for good, and education and philosophy and everything else. And that no entertainment act, they went way beyond an entertainment act, but very few people have had that kind of effect on the culture and society as the Beatles did. I wanted these tapes out desperately.
So is it okay if I tell listeners revealed here for the first time what you just said?
Please. No, absolutely.
Well, I was going to say, second, and underscore your point. It's come up on the show many times. They're the secular religion. There's nothing as unifying, as uplifting, as joyous, beyond making a bunch of good records that the Beatles projected. It resonated in 63 and 64. It resonates now. And that's huge. It's absolutely huge. And for any university to say, well, we're not interested in this stuff, that's insane.
It shows ignorance.
Totally.
It just really shows ignorance, especially since, UCLA teaches a course in the Beach Boys and they teach a course in the Beatles. So they think it's interesting enough you can get a college degree, or but they didn't realize that. Maybe this new book will change their opinions of how worthy these tapes are and how much they are a piece of history. And I guarantee you that before I'm dead, if I have to go to the universities myself and shake their doors, I'm going to make sure that I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they wanted them very badly, but it turns out that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's tapes of everything, of all the interviews and everything, is looked after by a community college.
Oh.
And I'm sure it's a fine community college, and I hear they do a great job, but I want to give these tapes to a bigger, richer, more wealthier institution that doesn't depend upon the community. And so that's what we're up to there.
It's going to happen. It's inevitable. It has to happen. So I'm not too worried about that. And I think that this book should be a good start when people recognize what it is, which is people that are beyond reach now, talking not that many years after the events. Of course, contemporaneous accounts of things are the best and most reliable, but these are still sort of close to the event. And as you point out, it was a good thing that so many of these interviews took place before the death of John, because that absolutely is going to color the way people talk about things. Now, I will ask you this. I know that you were naturally due to interview John for this book before what happened. Did you make the judgment at the time, well, I want to talk to John and Yoko separately? Because if they're sitting down next to each other, that's going to color absolutely the way they respond to things.
No, I don't think we actually thought about how to do it. And then we were only interviewing John so much later in the process because Peter and I went from Laguna Beach to London and really didn't have that much time. You know, we both lived in New York City, so we really didn't have that much time to talk to John. Mm-hmm. So Peter says he called John and told him that he was doing the book and that he'd speak to him when he got back to New York for Thanksgiving, which was, of course, the week before John was killed. Mm-hmm. I never thought about doing Yoko separately from John, but that's how it turned out. And that turned out to be an incredible, revealing interview, I think. The other thing is that you always leave your most important interview to last. A lot of people who started out in journalism think, I'm going to go to the star first, and then all the other people around them. But the way really to do it was by the time I got to Yoko, I really knew the story backwards and forwards. I knew the dates, what had happened. I could catch her in little lies. I could help her along with the truth as well. And so we were saving the big guns until last. The ones that I couldn't save until last was Paul. I didn't interview Paul first either, but Paul, I had to do him while we were in London. So those 3 months or so that we were in London was when I interviewed Paul.
Did you get a sense that Peter undervalued Paul's input? Because I did read a quote somewhere that he would deflect and he would just go chattering on and really not give you what you were looking for.
He was amazing. He was amazing. Everybody says, oh, they were tricked. You told them you were writing a book about the 60s. But once I started asking Paul about his girlfriends and his affairs and all the rest of that and everything, he could have said, hey, you're going to write a book about the 60s. Why are you asking me this stuff for? But he really got into it. And he really told me a lot of things that he'd never told anybody before. And at some point in that interview, by the way, and it's in the new book, he says, oh, so this is for your little book about the 60s? He realized, that. And then Ringo, when I was interviewing Ringo, he said at some point during the interview, hey, I like this. Ask me more questions. So they were very open. George was the only one who was closed off, and that's his personality.
Right. And every one of their interviews, I think, especially Paul's, as you're speaking, I was surprised by his frankness. When you're asking about Maggie McGivern comes up, which I never expected to hear Paul talking about. It was fascinating to see stuff that, as a guy who's read every book and every interview and every article, it's like, wow, nobody's ever asked about this before. That was great.
Thanks.
Yeah. I will say that with The Love You Make, there were aspects of it. It came out after Shout and before Goldman's book. And obviously all of it was after John had been killed, when there was absolutely a big appetite for Beatles history and insider stuff. And that was, in fact, the subtitle of the book, An Insider's Account of the Beatles, with Peter Brown's name out in front. There were aspects of it that fans found offensive in terms of characterizations. And you said earlier that you were responsible for the content of the book, except for the things that you got directly from Peter. The bit about Ringo's drums being replaced by Paul is straight up nonsense. I don't know if it was qualified by saying, well, the word was, or I heard people said. The picture in the book, John laying on the floor cutting a vocal during the White Album sessions, being described as he's too stoned. Again, that's not what is actually being seen in the picture. But that's the kind of stuff that rubbed the fans the wrong way. It was like, if there was a way to negatively characterize something, it almost seemed as though there was an aspect that Peter Brown was doing some score settling. And I wonder if you could speak to that, if you had that sense in real time, or do you think, on the whole, he was just trying to be straightforward and that was where he was sitting?
You can't blame Peter Brown for that. It was me who was writing it. Peter could have said, oh, that's completely wrong, but he never said that. The photo caption about John was, in fact, too stoned on heroin to record certain songs. And that was a real turning point in the group when John got into that level. So I don't know if the photo caption is right. What happened was I wanted to write what was true. I wanted to write it as it happened, and I didn't want to make it sound bad. But if that's what happened, that's what happened. See, everybody thought, oh, this is Camelot. This is wonderful. Everybody is terrific. Sure, there's the villains. There's Alan Klein and Magic Alex and stuff. Sure, there are villains, but the Beatles should be perfect and virgins and all the rest. And it wasn't that, you know. So this is what outraged the fans, I believe. The one thing that outraged the fans so much that they turned against this book. Now, for turning against this book, it sold over 500,000 copies. Just amazes me. It was about John going to Spain with Brian. It was much, much, much talked about in the Beatles circles, and what might have happened and what happened in Spain. Did they or didn't they? John told conflicting stories. But here's the thing. In 1983, when that book came out, first of all, it was the middle of AIDS. People were horrified to think that anybody might have an experimental contact, two men together. That a gay man and a straight man would go away on vacation together was like, oh my God. You know, now we wouldn't think twice.
Right.
We wouldn't think twice about any of these things. Do I believe that John allowed Brian to do something? Maybe. I don't doubt it. John was a pathfinder. He was an experimental person. He loved Brian. Brian loved him. These things don't happen out of love, though. I mean, it probably wasn't an act of love, but Brian was always physically attracted to John. And I spoke to Cynthia and I spoke to everybody else. And there was a fist fight over it in Liverpool when John got back. So there was really something there that I felt was necessary to put into the book. Boy, did that make fans upset. That just made, and that I scuffed up Paul's shoes. They wanted all of this to be Camelot. And they weren't ready for this book. And I don't think it was mean. And I sure didn't try to get anybody. And Peter did not try to play catch it with anybody. I did the interviews. Peter sat in on some. If there's a fault to it, it's me. Then it's not Peter. I'll take the blame for it if there's blame.
Sure.
Just wanted to write the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything else.
And that's fair enough. I mean, you would have had less of a dog in that fight in terms of, well, I'm going to spin this negatively to bring the Beatles down a notch. I get where you seem very sincere and you're coming at it that I just want to tell the true story, warts and all, which was an expression that they used in some of the things that they set out to do, such as the Get Back project, Let It Be project. It was not beyond their ken to want to be truthful about themselves. Maybe sometimes people don't like the truth about themselves that they know to be true said out loud. But I will say that one of the things very striking about the book that you were way ahead of the curve on was talking about John's heroin addiction and that being a leading cause of the Beatles' disintegration. Do you want to speak about that a bit more? I trust that as a canny researcher and a guy that probably knows a bit about drug addiction, which is more than some writers might know, that you can speak to that in a way that actually is worth something.
Well, John wrote Cold Turkey. And if you ask Yoko what Cold Turkey was about or where it happened and everything, it was just a baloney story. And so many other people that people don't usually, the art dealers, like their friends and everything, talked about seeing needles at Tittenhurst.
Yeah, Magic Alex, I believe. And again, not the most credible of witnesses, but it's in the book.
It's in the book, and there are several people who kind of say the same thing. So I realized, listen, if you're on heroin, even if you're just snorting it or whatever, I don't really know, but it's got to affect you in some way. Yoko was already there in the middle of everything. And then John suddenly gets this new addiction that makes it difficult for him to participate. There was no way I could put that in the book. He did write Cold Turkey. It was an admission that he had problems. But the depth of the problems, the length of the problems, and why it happened was still out there. So I asked Yoko about it, and we discussed it fully. It's so interesting. I'm sorry John went through that. I'm glad that he got out of it and became a house husband and did all the wonderful things that he could with his son. I'm glad that that was just a portion of his life. But again, we keep on saying this is historic. I think that that part of it had to be, if it was a secret private thing, that would be one thing. But to write Cold Turkey about heroin withdrawal, I felt that I should have asked Yoko those questions. And she was very honest, Yoko. Yoko told me the truth, I think, in some places. She didn't want to say that she was pregnant while she was taking heroin or had miscarriages. So she kind of fudged that part. But that's all in the book.
There's a term in intelligence community called limited hangout you might be familiar with, where you cop to some things but not everything, just to get people off your back. And I suspect that's the way it was with the Lennons and heroin. They'll admit so much but not everything. And there is a talk in the Yoko conversation about the driving across the country in a limo to kick heroin cold turkey. There are aspects of that we know to be true. It was a Chrysler station wagon, not a limo. And apparently they were going to San Francisco to kick methadone. I don't know if that was something that came up in your conversations or not, but that's something that other people have reported. So there is that. Now, what I wanted to ask...
I didn't even know that they were on methadone.
Yeah, as of 72.
I had no idea. This is the first time I'm hearing it.
Feel free to look into it yourself, but that was the thing that they were specifically going for treatment in 1972 in San Francisco for, when they were doing this cross-country jaunt. So that is what I've read, and maybe there's somebody out there to talk to as a direct witness to it. But that word never came up in her conversation with you, is what I'm saying.
No, never.
Did you watch all of the Get Back film?
You bet. Twice.
Okay. Now, were there things you learned in there or saw for yourself? Because there is talk in these conversations in the new book about the Let It Be sessions, and it's come up more than once in there where people talk about the Beatles being at each other's throats, and we know that's not the case. Was there anything that you found particularly revelatory that you wish you maybe had known sooner, that we didn't have to wait 50 years for?
Not about their interpersonal relationships or whether they were at each other's throats. Or I don't think I wrote that they were at each other's throats, but supposedly the story was. And then you see this and you see that there's tremendous tension between them, but they're certainly not each other's throats. They did have yelling and screaming sessions in the office on Savile Row at the Apple office, but I don't think any of that happened while the cameras were going on. What I did learn, and it gives me the chills even now, was John would like strum something and I'd say, I know those notes. Oh my God, that's the way they wrote this song or whatever song it was. It was like, look at that. We actually saw the birth of this incredible Beatles song that everybody would hear forever. And he just kind of picked out some notes. And then Paul picked out some notes. These songs were born out of their heads. They were amazing. They were an amazing team of songwriting and of singing and of lyrics and stuff. And they really deserve all the credit. That's what that film made me think. You know, it's very interesting in that movie because nobody notices it, but Peter Brown is in that movie for a quick second. He comes to the studios where they're working, the movie studio where they're working, and he asks to speak to John and Yoko aside, but he doesn't realize that either John or Yoko is mic'd. And he says, Alan Klein is in town and he'd like to speak to you. He says he's staying at the Dorchester. And John and Yoko says, do we have to go tonight? And Peter says, no, it's okay. You can go tomorrow. He'll still be here tomorrow.
That's good. That's good. Oh, yeah. He's coming on Friday. Okay. So I think you leave it till the end of the day. It's about 6 o'clock on Friday.
I think, what are we doing till Friday night?
Friday night is...
He's not coming for a day, is he?
No.
I'll see him on Monday night.
Yeah, okay.
No. Tell him we'll go to dinner, Alan Klein.
Oh, I see.
Monday night.
Well, what happens is that I realize that they do go that night. They don't tell anybody, but they do go that night to see Alan Klein. And it's that night that Alan Klein spins them and turns them around to say that he's going to. So that to me was fascinating to see Peter Brown come in knowing what was going to happen.
That prompts me to ask you, have you discussed Get Back with Peter Brown? Did he watch it?
I'm sure he did. Yeah. I don't know what he said or thought about it, but I'm sure he did. Peter is so associated with the Beatles. I mean, it's not a bad thing to be associated with, but his whole life has been that. And he has a lot of other things. So I don't know how deeply he's been best friends with Patty. Very, very close. They just came back from Marrakesh together. Or maybe she was there with her husband and Peter joined them, but that was like 4 weeks just last month. Mm-hmm. So he's still very friendly with them, but not most other people. The person that I loved the best was Cynthia. I really, really liked Cynthia. She was so melancholy and so sweet and so, a lovely person and kind of an elegant woman. I really liked her a great deal. As soon as I met her, I liked her a great deal. And she told me that she was now trying to be an artist because she had gone to art school and all that. And she showed me some of her drawings. So I live on the end of Long Island where there are a lot of art galleries, and I knew a lot of the owners of the art galleries. So I said to her, what if I can get you a show at an art gallery where I live? And she said, oh my God, I would love that. That would be great. And I said, this isn't going to be hard. So I went back and I went to Tower Gallery, a wonderful gallery, and I said, Cynthia Lennon, blah, blah, blah. I said, I'd love to do that. We'll schedule it for the height of the summer. So I called Cynthia, and a girlfriend of hers flew in from Liverpool. They stayed at my house for 2 weeks. Cynthia lived at my house for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And it was a huge success. I don't think she sold anything. But hundreds and hundreds of people came to Tower Galleries, and she was thrilled. Still very melancholy about John and the way everything had happened. I thought at that point she would have been over it. But her last night, we all went out to a steak restaurant and had a big dinner and a lot of wine. And on the way home, we were right near the beach, and she said, can we go wading in the water? It was nighttime. It was pitch black. There was no moon. And I said, what's that? She said, I'll roll up my dress and tie it as a knot. You roll up your pants. We were with my friend Joe Olshan, who is a swimmer by, that's what he does for exercise. And her girlfriend, so I said, fine. So we went to the beach. We rolled up. We were all held hands, and we walked into the water, maybe 2 or 3 into the water. A wave came, a huge wave, knocked us over out of the clear blue sky. We all were knocked over, and we all got up quick except for Cynthia. Cynthia was pulled out, face down. And we started screaming, Cynthia, Cynthia, and this panic. And Joel Oshan said, there she is. We could see her skirt billowing in the back. And he jumped in. If Joe wasn't there, he jumped in, swam out to her. This is in a matter of seconds. She was maybe 20 feet out. He pulled her head out. And we dragged her back to the shore, and then we were all sopping wet. We got back into my car, and I don't know what hit us, but we got hysterical laughing, screaming, crying with laughter, so much I couldn't start the car. So we're driving back to my house, and Cynthia says, I could really use a nice fire, to sit by a nice fire now. And I thought, what a great idea, but I didn't have any wood. Listen to this one. I didn't have any wood. So we get back to the house, and I had a stack of newspapers. So I said to Joe Olshan, help me roll up these newspapers really tight. So we rolled up all the newspapers, about 20 pieces of rolls of newspapers, and I put them in the fireplace, and I lit them. And they flamed up beautifully for 4 minutes or 5 minutes. And then they all died. And Cynthia, I said, I'm sorry, Cynthia. And she said, it's the story of my life, a paper fire. Oh man!
Oh, geez,
It's so sad. It burns brightly, and then and I did a weird thing. We all put our clothes on the fence, hung it on the fence behind the house. And the next morning, I got up and I took a picture of the clothes, and I said, "This is silly. Nobody's going to believe." And Cynthia nearly drowned. It just looks like people's clothes drying on So I loved her. I thought she was absolutely terrific and wonderful. And I could go on a vacation with her to Marrakesh.
That's fantastic. I think it's really cool and amazing, the friendship that her and May Pang developed.
That Cynthia and May Pang developed.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think it is. I spoke to May yesterday. I like May Pang a lot. I think she's sweet. Mm-hmm. I really do. I think she's a nice person, and I think she was just a regular citizen who was thrust into international, I wouldn't call it fame, but notoriety, and everybody was after her and stuff. It must have been very, very difficult for her. And of course, it's been part of her life ever since. But she's a very nice girl. And I can't imagine that she and Yoko spoke every day. That's what they say.
Yes.
But she and Yoko spoke every day to report on John.
Have you seen the documentary?
Her documentary? No, I haven't.
Okay. It's very good. I would recommend it to you. I had her on the show a year ago, but she's been busy nonstop on her photography tour, and I'm hoping to get her back. But I was struck by reading that in your book when she describes John going back, being so matter-of-fact about it, and that she actually said she called Yoko to congratulate her. It was a very different telling from every other one I've read from her. or heard directly from her mouth. So that was interesting to me.
That was the story she was telling in 1980.
Yeah.
And I think that as time goes by, you tell more of the truth because the complications, the repercussions aren't going to be as bad. So you can tell more of the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I did want to ask you, late last year, when the purported last Beatles song came out, Now and Then, if you had a reaction to the song or the video or the making of film or both. As a guy that obviously now is in this world, what was your reaction?
Well, just in terms of music, fine. But there's a point where everybody's so desperate for something, animatronic figures or holograms or whatever. They're so desperate for something more, the Beatles. I think they should kind of stop or hold back unless some gem is discovered somewhere. I don't think, now I hear that Ringo and Paul are going out on tour together. Why would they continue to milk it? It's a perfect thing, and they should just go away from it. I also must tell you that I love the Beatles. They've been very kind to me. These 2 Beatle books have been kind to me. I'll always love them, but I've also moved on in a way. I went back and I did this book of my interviews, but I've also moved on in a way. I've stopped writing biography. I've written about places, real estate, the Hamptons. I've written 2 memoirs. One's coming out in September. And so it really bugged me when the New York Times did an interview with me and Peter. And he said Stephen Gaines best known for his warts and all biographies. And, I'm going to see him at a party tomorrow night. Peter Brown's giving a big party tomorrow night. I'm going to see the reporter. And I want to say the last biography, warts and all, I wrote was in 1993. That's 30 years ago. What about the 5 books since then? But they'll never...
You've been typed.
So that's what I think. That's what I'm going to have to live with, the warts and all guy.
Not the worst legacy to have.
She burned the book. Linda burned the book.
Supposedly there's a picture of it. I've never seen it.
I've never seen the picture. I'd love to see the picture.
Yes.
That would be great.
It would be. Somebody asked me this when I told them I was going to be talking to you. Ask him if Paul's burned this one.
I don't know if you've seen it yet. By some weird coincidence, in the summer, Paul lives about 1.5 miles from me. And we see each other constantly. And I never know if he knows me, if he recognizes me. I can never tell. The thing with Paul walking around out here and everything, and he's by himself walking around, is that people leave him alone. Mm-hmm. Here, they leave him alone. I think probably in New York City. But where I live in the East End of Long Island, people are very sophisticated and never bother Paul. I did say hello to Paul. There was a screening of Oppenheimer that he went to out here. And I was there, and we walked out by sheer coincidence, when you file out of lines, his wife and Paul on the other side. And I tried to start a conversation with him, but it didn't work.
Oh.
He just stared at me. I wasn't sure if he knew who I was or what. He doesn't speak to Peter Brown, though.
Oh.
I know that.
Interesting.
He doesn't speak to Peter. Yeah.
Okay. So it's fair to say you've not been in touch with him since your interview with him.
I haven't been.
Interesting. I just wonder if he's still carrying that around, if anybody brings the book up, the first thing that pops into his head is betrayal.
I believe it is. I believe he does,
You think he keeps a grudge for life?
Yeah, Linda was... Yeah, I think Paul does. And I think he does it out of a sense of righteousness, what he feels is righteousness. He's a very honest guy, I think. And I think he feels that he was had by Peter Brown. Although he went ahead in the interview and answered all my questions, if he thought they were inappropriate, he should have said, this is not what I'm here for. You want to know about the 60s and the ad lib and why we wore those clothes? Fine. But he didn't do that.
He is an interesting guy because Philip Norman, who spent most of his professional career just reviling Paul cooperated fully when he came to write his John bio and then a subsequent one on Paul. So it is interesting that he has more than enough right to say no to people who have not treated him well, but then he'll surprise you.
Peter was really an insider. And it was one of those guys, for Peter or any one of those people, to what he felt was a betrayal was a big deal. And I think Paul does hold grudges. But I think he's a good man and a righteous person, and I think that he's entitled to hold grudges. Can I just tell you one silly story?
Sure.
Because I just looked at myself in the screen, and it's hard seeing a 77-year-old man there. But in any event, this mustache. So I'm interviewing George Harrison. Talk about the material world. He has the biggest mansion of any of them.
Right.
Just huge. And when we came in, there were maybe 6 or 7 bicycles, two-wheel bicycles, parked right inside the house. And I said, "Oh, what are these for?" And he said, "Well, the house is so big that we actually ride bicycles to the other side of the house because it could take us 6 minutes to walk to the other side of the house." And so I said, "Great, where do you want to talk?" And he said, "How about a cup of tea in England?" I said, "Sure, I'd love some tea." So we go into the kitchen, and we're sitting at a table, this vast kitchen, and he's boiling water, and he's lecturing me. He's a very serious kind of guy. But it was interesting. And what was trying to tell him, I asked him if he realized the enormous power that the Beatles had, and the way people thought, and all the issues that they took on, that he got people to meditate, that even fashion changed. I said, "George, when you grew your mustache, I grew this mustache when I was 19 years old." And George says, "That's about the dumbest thing I ever heard." So, I promise you, it's a 100%. He couldn't believe that somebody grew a mustache because he did. But I wanted to look like a Beatle. We all did.
Sure.
We all wanted to have that hair.
Well, it is very funny that you asked George that question because I asked Patty the very same thing about not growing mustaches, but about did you realize in real time the power you had, any dress you wore, anything you did with your hair, being seen by millions
What did she say?
that she didn't really think about it in real time. But I said, well, you influenced George influenced the Beatles influenced this Western youth culture in terms of meditation, all that stuff. That is an incredible, you had this platform you didn't even ask for, and you used it for good. That is a commendable, amazing thing. And I think it was too big for her to wrap her head around, but yeah, sometimes I think about that. It was funny. You just reminded me that reading the George interview, I was very struck by him speaking in anticipation of you talking to John. Oh, he's going to be negative. He's so negative. That was an interesting perspective George had about how John would be when you talk to him.
One of them called him a piece of SH, John, a piece of, I forget who it was. John could be meaner and more cutting than anybody you knew. And I don't think George had it in him that way.
Yeah, even Yoko said that about not being on stage at Bangladesh. Well, George would never say, George is too polite to tell me not to appear because I don't want you.
Well, I don't know what the truth is actually behind that story, but they all said mean stuff. They didn't say mean stuff. They all said John was mean. They all said that John was mean and difficult, and he was. This poor kid said to him, who was a rock and roll critic, said, "Does it make you feel old to see Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band?" And, he kind of shoved me aside. I mean, I guess he had run out of patience. There's a story in the book told by, I think it's a movie producer. I forget his name. And
David Putnam?
Yes, I think David Putnam tells the story.
That was a great chapter. I love that. And it's such a non-obvious person to interview. I was so glad that was in the book.
Me too. You never know who's going to have the best observations. And he really did. Well, do you remember the story about how John puts a cigarette in the water?
Yes.
What a mean thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, very briefly, they were at the ad lib, and a waiter came by and took away like a pitcher of water, a glass of water. He was going to refill it, and John said, "I'm not done with that." And the waiter said, "I'm just refilling it for you, sir." And you can imagine how these people were trembling. This is in front of the Beatles at the ad lib. And he brought back another pitcher, another glass, and John took a cigarette and put it out in the water that this poor waiter had just brought him, and stared at the waiter. And Putnam said his blood ran cold watching John do that. And so John had a really kind of mean side to him.
Yeah, and perversely, you have Peter Brown saying in the foreword to the book, John was everybody's favorite.
I think he was everybody's favorite because he was just a star in a certain kind of a way. It's odd that Peter said that John was everybody's favorite. He certainly was Peter's. Well, Peter and Brian were very, very close. Peter started as Brian Epstein's assistant. Peter saw John through Brian Epstein's eyes. And John depended and trusted Peter to arrange the wedding. of him and Yoko. I heard Peter tell this story. I don't really remember it for the first time, but he says when John and Yoko first got together, there was this huge outrage by the press. And, this Japanese woman has stolen our English property and stuff like that. And they were afraid to be seen together. So Peter had an apartment in London, which he didn't use or something. And he gave the key to John. And he said, you can use my apartment to have assignations, whatever that means, with Yoko. So they started their affair in Peter Brown's apartment in London, which I thought was kind of really fascinating. They were so afraid of being seen together that they kind of had to hide and meet in this apartment. But Yoko says that they didn't have sex for 3 months. Peter said to me a couple of weeks ago, it was longer than 3 months. I don't know how he found that out, but he said, I think it was longer than 3 months that they didn't have sex, John and Yoko.
And Tony Bramwell says that too in his book, that it started way before that magical consummation that ended with making the Two Virgins album.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, and he would have been around, so.
Yeah, absolutely. That's their relationship. Yoko's, 90, 91 now?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Just turned 91.
Just turned 91. And Peter's birthday tomorrow. That's very interesting. We're all getting up there. Not you yet.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song performed by the Corgis.